this computer. All right, so today's class, actually, I'm going to go to WhatsApp first, show you some pictures. Those who are not on our WhatsApp group, you want to join our WhatsApp group to get some extra stuff before and after this class. Definitely will help you in these. We're doing all these pictures. So some cool stuff. I know I'm always asked, what's the reason for things? So we're going to learn about the Mizbeach, the altar. So that's what the altar looked like. We're going to learn, it was 5 amos by 5 amos by 10 amos high. 5 by 5 squares, 5 by 5, and then the height was double the length. So it's 5 by 5 square with the height being 10 amos high. And that's where they would bring all the sacrifices. It was in the courtyard, and we'll learn about the courtyard where they placed this exactly. I'll show you another picture where it was placed. It was also a ramp. We learned, it doesn't teach us about the ramp in today's Chumash, but we learned about the ramp a few parshas ago, which Hashem said, I don't want the ramp to be made out of steps because then people's feet are spread apart, and that is not respectful for the altar. And therefore, it should be a ramp, which is kind of your feet are a little bit closer together as you're going up the ramp, and it's more respectful for the ark. An interesting idea. But anyway, look at the ramp here. Look at the altar. You'll notice a number of things. So if you see the designs, okay, you see the word border. The ramp had a border that was 1/10, right? I said it was 10 amos high. So 1/10 of that was this kind of a border. Under that was an interesting kind of a mesh. You'll notice a lattice. You see on the side, it says lattice and a mesh. So it was a kind of a lattice that was built around the altar, like a part of the design of the altar. So that also took up 1/10. So 1/10 was the border, 1/10 was the lattice. Then from the bottom of the lattice and down, it was 5 amos. And then you had the 1 amma of the lattice, the 1 amma of the border, making the design on the altar. And you had another 3 amos on top of the border going up, which makes a total of 10. So 3 on top, 5 on bottom, and then the 2 borders in between, the lattice and the border, which make up the Mizbeach, the altar. On top of the altar, it kind of had horns, you'll notice. So it had, at the 4 corners, it had a space with horns at the 4 corners of the altar. In between the corners, that's where the Kohanim would work, where they would need to get around. So there's a fire in the middle, and they're bringing a sacrifice, and they have to flip the meat. So they would walk around the border in between the corner of the horn, in between the horns, and they would take care of business and do whatever they needed to do with the meat. Another thing I missed is with all the other parts of the altar, of all the other pieces of furniture that they built, they always carried it. So in the lattice on the altar, there was 2 rings on each side, 2 different sides. There was a total of 4 rings. They stuck the poles in between the rings, and that is how they carried the altar. Okay, so now some of the significance, let me just show you first actually where in the Mishkan it was placed. So right here's another picture. You'll notice that that's the altar. Right there in the middle is the altar, in the middle of the courtyard. And then there's this very large courtyard, much larger than the altar itself. We'll learn about that later on, of how the courtyard was made. So we'll talk about that later on. We'll get back to that soon. I know always the class always asks me, they want reasons for stuff, why we do stuff. So here's a very interesting text from the Medrash on this verse. The Medrash says, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, tell them to erect an altar for burnt offering so that it may atone for the sins of my sons. And here is something interesting. I made an agreement with Abraham, their forefather, that if his sons sinned, I would forgive them because of the sacrifices. So Hashem promised Avram that Abraham basically, I guess, God says, I'll make your children the descendants. But what if the Jewish children sin? So eventually, am I just going to get rid of them? Can I renege on my contract with you, on my commitment to you? Hashem told Avram that your sons, I have a plan of how to deal with it. If your sons sin, and they sin, I'm going to have them bring sacrifices, and that's going to be a makeup method after they sin in order for them to make up with me. And God tells Abraham at that point in time where he makes a commitment with him, he says, take for me a heifer of 3 years old and a she-goat, take for me some animals, and already start bringing like kind of sacrifices now to indicate that sacrifices will be a major part of history, that when I deal with your children's sins, which they will sin, I have a system in place of a way that they can ask forgiveness. So here is where he says something interesting. What do the letters in the Hebrew word mizbeach, how do we say altar in Hebrew? It's spelled mizbeach. Mem, Zayin, Beis, and a Ches. What do they stand for? Why is it called Mizbeach? So the Mem stands for Mechila, means pardon, forgiveness. The Zayin, the second letter, stands for Zchut, which means merit. The Bet, the third letter, stands for Bracha, blessing, and Chet stands for Chaim, stands for life. So the burnt offerings ascend on this account, and that's why so this is the piece of furniture which we're discussing today in our class. Very interesting. This is just to add some significance to our lesson today, that we're going to build a mizbeach, an altar. In Hebrew, it's called mizbeach, a mem, zayin, bet, and ches, a place that the Jewish Hashem promised Avram that the Jewish people will need forgiveness, and Hashem will forgive them on the mizbeach, and that's why part of the temple furniture is this important item, is this important mizbeach. One more interesting thing. We're going to learn that. So we learned about the lattice. So I was wondering, why do they need a lattice why is that part of the design, right? A lot of times people ask me, what's the point of like in the menorah, the knobs and the flowers? We discussed a little bit of that on the Tuesday night class. So just here, look quickly. I'm not sure if this is the full reason. So I think it says, if in Hebrew it says, in case the coals would fall off the altar, or pieces of meat from the meat they're sacrificing would fall off. We don't want them to become disqualified by falling on the ground, because that will make them not holy anymore. So there was a lattice that was needed. It was kind of a netting, very interesting, that was just a practical thing that would catch the meat that would fall off the altar, in order that the coals and the meat should not be disqualified by hitting the floor. So this netting, I guess, when it would fall off the side, would catch the coals or the stuff falling off. Anyway, when I saw this, I thought it was a fascinating reason to explain. We always ask why this, why that. Now, if you're wondering why there's lattice on the side of the altar, now you know why. This is a very interesting commentary. I know it's in Hebrew, but interesting commentary brought that helps us explain some of the design, perhaps why the design was needed. In the Beis Hamikdash, they had a huge altar in the temple, and they'll actually build, King Solomon will build it. No lattice will be required because the meat won't fall off, because it was so big. They didn't require something to catch it if something's falling off. Just so some of the stuff, designs, it's interesting, our practical reason could be in order to help assist in the temple. Okay. Going to today's Chumash. Today is Friday, so we're going to discuss, as I said, the altar in today's parsha, into the first section of today's Chumash. And you should make the altar, right? We already discussed the menorah, and we discussed the table, the lechem aponim, the table of the bread, and we discussed the ark, and we discussed the curtains, and we discussed the beams. And today we're moving on to discuss the altar. The altar that was outside, right outside the room. It wasn't inside the Mishkan, which we were discussing. It's going to be in the courtyard. And you should make the mizbeach atishitim out of pine wood, out of acacia wood, out of pine wood. And how big should it be? This is going to be by far the biggest item we have. Now you might ask a question: you'll see soon, how did they carry this massive piece in the desert? Everything was movable. How big was it? It was 5 amos oirach, 5 amos roichav, revuah hamizbeach. It was 5 amos by 5 amos, and it was shalish amos kemasi. The height was 3 amos just from the lattice, from the border piece. There was 5 amos, 3 amos going up, but a total it was 10. So it was 5 amos by 5 amos by 10 amos, and that in feet is 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet by 15 feet high. Can you imagine 50 feet high? It was like as tall as as tall as a building, as tall as a floor, full 2 floors even. I don't know. It's really big. I don't know how they carried it. So we'll see later on that it was made out of copper, just a thin copper casing that whenever they got to, they would fill it up with dirt. They shoveled, I guess, and they made a big pile of dirt and covered the dirt with the copper casing, that they had a thin copper casing that was light enough, I guess, in order for them to carry. So it was quite large. how did they carry it? Because it was completely hollow on the inside, and two people were able to carry it. Something very interesting. Okay. Verse 2. Vasisa karnoisav. You should make horns. You should make horns for the four corners of Arba Pinoisav Yemenitia. The horn should be, the copper should be part of the original copper that you're casting, that you're making it out of. Don't add and put on like a lot of other stuff from the temple. We learned the menorah and the cherubs. We can't put it on after, connect the two pieces, solder them together. The original copper of the corners has to be made from the copper of the actual mizbeach of the altar itself. The Yemenitia should be from it. And you should overlay it with copper. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said something wrong. It was wood. It was pine wood. So the form, I correct myself. In verse 1, it said that it was made out of, I jumped ahead of myself. It was made out of a very thin pine wood. On top of the pine wood, to protect it, was a copper plating. Obviously, you can't light a fire on pine wood. It will burn the pine wood. So they had a thin layer of copper that covered over the entire mizbeach. So Rashi has an interesting question, and he asks something. He says, look, I don't understand. Why is it that the menorah was made out of gold, pure gold? The ark was either the cover was made out of pure gold, and the box was covered with gold. Then you told me about the beams in the Mishkan; they were also covered with gold. The everything we learned about was covered out of gold. Why is it? And why is that? Because we actually saw a commentary today in the Medrash that Hashem made gold for one reason, to be used for the Beis Hamikdash, to be used for the temple. That's the reason Hashem made gold. So the question is, why is it that the altar is being covered with copper and not gold? What's the reason that we're using copper instead of gold? Why wouldn't gold do to use for the for this thing? So I think also some that maybe copper is also the strongest of all kind of metals. But why wouldn't gold do? Maybe you should still do a gold plating on it. It says very interesting that the copper, Rashi says, represents, again, we're going into a reason behind it, is azus metzach, is people who are haughty, or like they're not healthy. They're too stubborn. I think stubborn is the right word for it. They're very stubborn. And a lot of sins, I guess, come from stubborn. So the stubbornness, like, why don't we learn already? Why do we keep on sinning? So the altar was specifically made out of copper, representing the stubbornness of the Jewish people in order to heal us and cure us from the stubbornness that we have. So as I said before, the altar was made as to ask forgiveness for the Jewish people. And what better way for it to be made out of than in a metal that represents this idea of stubbornness, because that is exactly what it's representing for the Jewish people. So unlike everything else that's made out of gold, this is made for forgiveness specifically, and therefore we don't want it made out of gold. We want it made out of copper to represent the thing that it's asking forgiveness for, which is the stubbornness of the Jewish people. Okay, so just another interesting, fascinating idea behind it. But that's verse number 2. Verse number 3. Now, so what did this altar have? Vasisa, you should make for it siroisav. You needed pots. Why did you need pots? Ledashnoi, to remove the ashes into the pot. So you would burn all night, stuff would be burning there. And what do? You needed a special kind of pot that you would remove all the ashes that were burnt overnight into that pot. Whatever you do, whatever they would do with it afterwards, they would get rid of it. They would put it in a holy heap, I believe, somewhere. So they would take all. So you needed a pot in addition to the altar. It had to have these pots. It also needed yav. You needed shovels. Okay, what did it need shovels for? That's how you would get the ashes from the altar into the pot. So it came with, it had additional utensils that was used for it. So you needed a shovel that you would stick in to the coals and to stick in to clean up. You use the coals and you put it in, the yav would put it into the shiraisav, into the pots that were made to hold the ashes. Umizra kaisav, and you also had something called mizra kaisav. What's mizra kaisav? Mizra kaisav are special kind of sprinkling bowls. So what would you need a sprinkling bowl for? When they would slaughter the animal, they would right away, the first blood that would come out of the animal is what would be sprinkled on the altar, what they would sprinkle on the mizbeach. So they would take this mizra kaisav, these sprinkling bowls, go to the animal. As soon as the animal was slaughtered, they would collect the blood, and then they would use those bowls in order to sprinkle the blood on the altar. So good. So far we have the siraisav, are the pots where the ashes are going into, the ya'avs, which is the shovels that would put the ashes that was burnt overnight inside the pots, umizrakaisav, and we had also the sprinkling basins, bowls, which you would collect the blood in and sprinkle them on the altar. Then we had umizlagaisav, like in modern Hebrew, it's called a mazleg, is a fork. I mean, is a long fork that had at the end of the fork, maybe like a pitchfork, maybe more like, and it would have the teeth would be bent. You would stick it into the meat. This way it would catch onto the meat good, and you would flip the meat in that way, because in order for the meat to roast faster, you would want to flip it. You wouldn't want to keep it on one side. In order for the meat to get burnt faster, you would stick in this fork. These forks called mizlagaisav, these big giant pitchforks, forks. I think by my fireplace. When I bought the house, it came with this kind of a long fork that the fingers bend, and then here you stick it in the meat, and it gets good into the meat, and it flips the meat over in order to burn the meat faster. And then we had umachtoisav, and then we had another thing called a pan. Machtoisav is called he calls it here a scoop. So the first one is a flesh hook to catch the meat and flip it. The next one is a scoop. What would you use the scoops for? Machtoisav, this is the last utensil that goes along for the altar. It means that they would take this machta, these shovels, these scoopers, these scoops. They would scoop out a good hot coals, good hot ashes. They would move the coal side to side and scoop out the good hot ashes. Then they would take it, bring it inside the tabernacle itself, because this was in the courtyard. They would put it on the little altar, which we're going to learn about in next week's parsha. We don't learn about in this week's Torah portion. They would put it on top. Then they would take some very good smelling spices, put the spices on top of the ketores, the incense, put it on top of the fire, and the smoke would come out. It would smell amazing, and so on. It would be special ketores before Hashem. How would you get those coals from the outer mizbeach into the inner mizbeach? They use something called these scoopers, called machtoisav, was a special scooper, and that was that. So we had the shovel that you would shovel the clean up after the night, all the coals. You would put it to have a special shovel that would put it into a special pot, and then you would have a special utensil to collect the blood that we'd sprinkle on the altar. You also had these forks to flip the meat. You also had the special scooper in order to collect the ashes from outside to inside, from the outside altar to the inside altar. That are the utensils that go along with the mizbeach. L'chol kelav, tas, and nechoshes, and all the vessels should be made out of copper. Everything here is being made out of copper. Unlike everything else was made out of gold. I already explained what was unique. Rashi tells us what was so unique about the copper that we spoke about. Okay, moving right along. That's verse 3. Okay, you guys are getting the whole picture of all the vessels in the temple. And you should make a design. And this is the lattice, the copper grating. So I showed you in the picture before, in the middle of the altar, middle of the mizbeach was a copper grating. I showed you one of the commentaries. It said, interesting, maybe to catch the meat or the coals that would fall off, instead of them hitting the floor, they would fall into this copper grating. Maybe there was a little bit of an angle, I'm not sure, but that would make sense then, that the coals and the stuff would fall in. Michbar Meiser Reshes, it would be a copper grating with a netting work, right? With a kind of a netting work was the way this copper grating was made. Vasisa al hareshes arba tabois nechoshes, and then on the copper lattice, this grating, you would stick on the rings, 4 rings, al arba ketzaisav, on its 4 ends. Right, so you're going to make the rings that are going to carry this massive altar. That's a shell. You're going to carry it. So you need to put 4 rings in it. And what go in the rings? Verse 5. And the netting with the rings were under the ledge. Okay, which I said before, which had this border, this kind of border. So there was 2 designs. It was like a border design. Under the border was a lattice. So put the lattice netting design under the border design. Lamata under it. So what will happen is there's 10. I told you it's 10 amas high. The whole altar, the whole mizbeach is 10 amas high. I don't have it. It's maybe my one of my codes. So the whole mizbeach is 10 amas high. The first 3 amas of the height was nothing. Then the 4th amma from the top was the border. The 5th amma from the top was the netting, and then there and down was nothing to the bottom. So you had 2 circle designs, each 1/10 each, together making up 2/10, which was designed towards the center of the altar of the Mizbeach. I'm going to just share with you, why was it important to have, Rashi shares with us here, I think it's here, why was it important to have a border? And Rashi says that when we're going to learn about the sacrifices, there's going to be a specific recipe about where the blood needs to be sprinkled. Depending on the sacrifice, the blood needs to either be sprinkled on top of the border, on top of the altar, or under the border on the bottom of the altar. So a border is very important here to differentiate, to distinguish between the top and the bottom. So let's say, according to the commentator, the lattice is to catch the stuff that falls out, but the border has a very specific purpose here, is we have to know what's considered on top, what's considered on the bottom. So the border design is actually there for a very specific purpose. He says, it does say elsewhere that was another kind of a border, and that was on the top of the altar in between the corners. The reason why maybe they made those corner horns sticking out was because the Kohanim needed place to walk around, and it wasn't so big then, they could fall off easily. It was only 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet, and if you're roasting and it's a big fire there, the Kohanim would need a place to walk around. So they had two amas, actually, one amma in between the corners, and maybe another amma a little bit outside of where the corners on top of the altar were, and that flooring was a little bit lower than the center. So they knew we could walk around here safely. There's no coals here, there's no fire here. We could walk around the top of the altar, and we could play, and we could work with the fire and what we're burning in the middle of the altar. So there was another kind of a ledge that's on the tippity top of it, which was down. It was a little bit down just to give them some space to walk around, which was evident clear where their pathway was to walk around. But then under it, there was another border, which we're discussing here, which is to tell you where does the blood go, on the top of the border or on the bottom of the border, to know which is the top of the altar and which is the bottom of the altar. Anyway, this is some fascinating stuff in this very unique thing that Hashem built in order to bring forgiveness for the Jewish people. I want to see if I'm missing anything. Yeah, and they would fill up the altar, as I mentioned. It was really just a shell. It was made out of pine wood with a copper shell, and they would fill it up with dirt and stick the altar on top of the dirt, and that was considered the altar because it really is supposed to be on dirt. Okay. I also mentioned before there was also a ramp. The Torah is not telling us about the ramp, but we learned in the parsha a few weeks ago that Hashem does not want steps. Hashem wants a ramp, and they would make this really long ramp in order for the Kohanim to walk up without spreading their feet too much. At a good angle, they would walk up on the ramp. By the way, I believe they didn't wear shoes. There was Kohanim who would get sick, actually, because their feet had to touch this copper and all the stuff, and it could get cold in Jerusalem. And I didn't know it just snowed there the other day. Here they are in the desert, but they would walk up on the ramp in that way. Verse 6. Vasisa badim la mishkan. You're going to make carrying poles to go in those rings we just spoke about before. It's made out of pine wood. And again, it's got to be overlaid with copper. There has to be copper. Everything in this mizbeach, in this altar, is copper to make up for the stubbornness of the Jewish people. And you put the carrying poles inside the rings. And whatever you carry, you'll stick in these poles, and they'll carry this big, tall, 15-foot item on their shoulders with the carrying poles and walk like that in the desert. Remember, they need to move from place to place. Verse 8, here's where it says you should make it hollow. Don't make this a 7.5 by 7.5 foot filled with pine wood. How in the world are you going to carry a thick 7.5 by 7.5 by 15 foot box? It's not possible. So make it hollow. Kasher heracha hera ischa bahar kenasu. Just as Hashem showed you on Mount Sinai exactly how to build this altar, that is how you should. That is how you should build it, and that is the Chumash for Friday. We're going to go into the Chumash for Shabbos, and as we're getting through the picture, I'm just going to bring back up the WhatsApp design so everybody can see here exactly the design of what we're learning. So here we go again. The picture. This is what the altar looked like that we just learned about. Okay, it was 7.5 by 7.5 feet by 15 feet. With these carrying poles and the lattice and the border and the horns, everything we learned about is right over there. The base, I don't think I really saw the base in the Chumash today, but I guess maybe it says elsewhere or we missed it, but it seems like from the picture at least that there was a base there. Now, moving on to so where was this altar? Moving on to the courtyard. So you'll notice the courtyard was very big. You're going to see it was 100 cubits, 100 amas, which means that our room was 30 amas, which is still quite big, okay? 100 amas is 150 feet, right? So it's 150 feet by 50 cubits, which is 75 feet. So 150 feet by 75 feet, right? That's 7,005, right? Wait, what am I saying? Yeah, so 75 feet times 100 is, times 10 is 7,500. So it's 75,000, right? Does that make sense? 75,000 square feet is this thing, which is a huge amount of space. So the courtyard was massive. Now, someone asked me yesterday, like where you'd be allowed to walk to. So at least I know in the Beis Hamikdash, the non-Kohen would be able to walk up to right near the close to the altar, not far, like could go to the doorway that would entrance near the altar. I'm not sure if we're in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, they were allowed to walk. But anyway, the first half of the courtyard was massive. The first 50 feet, there was nothing. The room wasn't there. The actual tabernacle only started past 50 feet of the courtyard. So it was empty. I'm not sure where the altar was, but besides the altar, for sure it says the whole first 50 feet was clear. There was nothing there. Okay, it was a huge, just massive open, 50 cubits long by 50 cubits wide. There was nothing in that part of the courtyard. Everything, the whole Mishkan, the whole room was within the inside 50 feet of that courtyard. Okay, so the Mishkan itself took up 30 cubits of the back 50 feet, which left it 20 cubits from the back of the tabernacle until the back wall. Also, we know it was 10 amos wide, which left it 20 amos. It was right in the middle of the courtyard, which left it 20 amos on each of those two sides. So they're going to build this massive courtyard that you could take up and put down. We're going to learn exactly what it was and how it was built. So the first thing Rashi tells us is that it hung like sailing, like when you go sailing with you hang those the sails that you hang on the sailboats, right? I don't know if any of you have gone sailing. It hangs very tight. So these curtains, Rashi says, looked like sails. The way they hung on these poles were similar to the way you hang sails on sailboats. The only difference is on a sailboat, right? If you've ever gone sailing, you do not want holes in your sail because you want it to carry the boat. And this thing, though it hung like sails on a sailboat, it didn't look itself like sails because it had holes inside it, which is like the kind of netting. It was kind of like a netting, right? Like a fence. You could have like a full fence, right? Today we have these fences that you can't see in through at all. This kind of fencing was a fencing with holes so that you could see, I guess, somewhat. It looked like, I guess, like, we have those on a window. You have, what is it called? A screen. So it was kind of like a screen, I guess. The idea of it was kind of like a screen. And we're going to learn that inside the Chumash. Now, join me as we try to figure this out inside in today's Chumash. Okay, here we go. So, all right. So this is the Shabbos section. We're starting it now. Vasisa es chatzar hamishkan. You should make a courtyard for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan. You got to make a courtyard. The fas negev teimana, along the southern side, the long side, the 100 amma side. Kuloyim lachatzer, you should make hangings for the courtyard, right? You should make these masts, like these long curtains, these long screens. Sheish mashzar, what should they be made out of? Remember, a lot of the stuff we learned about has to be made of wool and 3 different colors. Not here. He says, no, not this netting, not this screen. It should just be made out of twisted fine linen, just the linen kind of threads is what the screen on the wall of the courtyard was made out of. Me'ah ba'ama had to be huge. It had to be 100 amas oirech lepas echaz along the southern border. It had to be south-facing border. It had to be 100 amas long. Very, very, very big. Va'amudav. Now, how did it stand up? How did you get this huge movable wall, this huge movable fence, this huge movable screen? How did you get it to stand? Va'amudav esrim. There was 20 pillars, 20 pillars that created it. So if you divide 20 by 100, right? Rashi tells you it's every 5 amas you need another pillar. So every 7.5 feet was another pillar until it got up to. That's how they got every five amas was what was another pole, and that's how you got 20 poles within 100. Right? Divide 100 by 20, you get to 5 every 5 feet. But the name Esrim, and each one had their own socket. Not like in the Mishkan, they sat on 2 sockets. These were pillars with sockets, a one-leg socket kind of socket which they sat on, And what were the sockets made out of? Not the same thing as in the tabernacle, again, copper. So the sockets of this outer wall is all going to be copper. However, the hooks that, remember, like a sailboat, the netting was sat on the hooks. What were those hooks made out of? They were made out of silver. And it also had a design, it seems like a belt, like a kind of a belt that went around these pillars, these beams that the curtain sat on. They had a silver kind of a belt. Rashi says, I'm not sure if it was a thin silver thing, a thick silver thing, but I think Rashi says that he assumes it seems like a thicker kind of silver design, a silver belt that went around these poles to add to their design. And that is a little bit about the pillars that it stood on. So southern wall, 20 pillars along 100 amma netting curtain. The Chaim the Pas Tafin, the sailing was in the north side, which they're both on the length side, the long side. Bayrach Kloyim Meya, they had 100 cubits long. It was hanging. Ayrach Vamudav was the Va'esrim, and he had 20 pillars. Vadrei Mesrim, and the pillar sat on 20 copper nechashas, 20 copper sockets that held them on the bottom. But again, the hooks and the belt was made out of silver. You had a little bit of silver on these poles that went around the courtyard wall. But what about the width? The Pas Yam on the eastern side, on the western side, Kiloyim Chamishim Amma. There was the hanging was only 50 amas. This time it was half the length. Asara, Amudei Masara, and so it only needed 10 pillars. It was half the side of the 100. The 100 had 20. This is 10. Vadnei Masara, and the sockets that held them were 10 sockets that went under the 10 beams. Okay. V'reicha v'chatzer. Lepas kedma mizracha 50 amas, which was a total width of 50 feet. So the length was 50 amas. Length was 100 amas, and the width is 50 amas. Okay, next one. What about the front door? Because the front, you need a doorway now, so the front is not going to have the same length as the back. It's not the back. We said was 50 amas with 10 pillars, but not so the front. So basically, you're going to have two corner walls coming in from the two ends on the eastern side. It's going to be, instead of being a full 50 amas, it's going to be 15 on one side and 15 on the other side, leaving you with a 20 amma right out of 50, 15 and 15. 50 minus 15 and 15 leaves you with 20, with a 20 amma door. So a doorway. It was 15 amas, was the claim, was the hanging curtains, lakasef on one side, and medem shleisha. So how many pillars did they need? 3 pillars for 15 amas, right? Every 5 amma you put another pillar. But the name shleisha, and they had the sockets that they sat on, the copper sockets, like the Chum is going to tell us, were made out of copper, right? So you had 3 on one on the eastern side, on the front side, on one edge. On the second edge of the front wall of the eastern wall, another 15 on the other side. And the name Shleisha, and again, it was 3 pillars and 3 sockets that those front walls sat on. And now you have an open space in the front door. And for the entrance to the courtyard, Masach, you had to put up a curtain. That was Esrim Amma, that was 20 Ammas open. So now you got to have a wall. So they built a wall a little further forward, so not everyone could see. And as they walked by, there was some kind of a curtain in the front. But the front wall, not like the curtains around the rest of the courtyard, which weren't as fancy. This is going to be more fancy. It's going to be made with the same kind of threads that we made all the other curtains. It's going to be made out of remember the blue, the purple, and the crimson wool threads together intertwined with the sheish mazor, with the linen. Each of those are going to be 6 times, each are going to be 6 threads over, special kind of sewing. But Maaseh Reikem, they're going to be embroidered. This kind of stuff is going to be embroidered. Amudei Marba, Vadnei Marba, their pillars for and their sockets for, because it was, again, 20, if you have a 20-foot long, wide door curtain, it's going to be every 5 feet, which 20 divided by 5 is 4. So you end up having 5, 10, 15, 20. You end up having 4 pillars that they're standing on. Okay, so again, I'm trying to remember there was I forgot to mention the curtain, just the not the doorway, the courtyard. I described it as a mat. You hung like they do on sailboats, right? What material was that made out of? And that Rashi says it was crochet hanging. I don't know sewing so much, but that was more like using it like a crochet. I don't know exactly what the difference between crochet and embroidering and so on, but or or different ways of sewing. We learned about, now we're learning about crochet. In the past, we learned about weaving, right? Remember the designs using and weaving, and we spoke about embroidery. So the front, as we're learning now, we're saying that it was embroidered. There was embroidery used. Work of embroidery was used on maybe the kind of pictures that were embroidered on the front curtain with these beautiful different threads that we're describing over here. Continuing right along, verse 17. All the pillars, whether that are around everything should have that silver band. There should be a common design on all the pillars of a silver band. And there should be silver hooks. And everything had copper bases, because we didn't mention by the curtains that they were using copper bases. That is a design. Everything around the whole courtyard, copper bases, copper. I think we said that they were, I'm not sure, I think we said they were all covered. Maybe the beams are also covered in copper. I don't remember. I believe we said that, but definitely a silver band on top and also a silver hook coming out of the thing where they would hang the curtain on. The bottom line is the length of the whole courtyard was 100 amas, and the width was 50 amas for kaima. We never discussed how tall was it. It was chamish amas. It was a 7.5 foot tall chamish amas. Right? I guess the common fence today, right? We have today is about 8 feet. Those were 7.5 feet. They were 5 amas tall. Sheish mashzar. They were made out of fine linen. And the copper of all the bases of everything was copper, and that is what we're learning about so far. Let me just see what we're holding over here. Okay, good. Yeah, verse 19. L'chol kli hamishkan, all the vessels of the tabernacle. L'chol avedasam, in all the work, you needed tools in order to build the tabernacle. Rashi tells us to put it together. They need some kind of like hammers there, mallets and hammers. They all had to be made out of copper. So what about those items? The tools needed to build it. So all the vessels to build it are going to be copper. And also now he just adds something interesting here, which we saw in some of the pictures. I didn't know if there was a source for that in the Torah. The chol yisei doisav, all the pegs. Why did they need pegs? Because the skins could flap perhaps in the wind. So to hold the skins, I guess once it came down on the sides of the tabernacle, and even the fence maybe that they're building the courtyard around, it could flap maybe in the wind. So just like when you go camping, you take pegs and you stick it in the ground and you tie a rope, you attach it down. So you chosei daisab, chosei desachatzer, all the pegs that were part of the holding down the tabernacle walls from flapping, right? The skins from flapping and the pegs and the border wall around the courtyard, and the chayshes, all those pegs were made out of copper. Rashi says he's not sure if they themselves were very heavy pieces. You don't have to put them in the ground, or you actually stuck these pegs in the ground. Rashi says he thinks that he stuck it actually in the ground. So I guess if the tabernacle sat there for a year, you didn't have to worry. Things wouldn't go flying away, and you'd have a hurricane, whatever, that we had, like I guess in Manalapan not too long ago. They had these things pegged in really well, and those were all made out of copper. And that is the end, my friends, of today's Chumash. Any questions or comments on today's Chumash? Who's still with us? I know this is a little bit of a different kind of a class, but if we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, we need to learn this more than ever, because you wouldn't know how it looks. You can't go there today and just see it. You need to really visualize it today together with us in our class. Any questions or comments on today's Chumash? Yes, Andrea.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you. So maybe I missed it, but was this the copper that the women donated from their mirrors? Didn't they have like copper mirrors that they donated the copper for, or this is not it?
I don't think so. I think Andrew's bringing something very interesting. I believe that was for the wash basin of the where the Kohanim would wash their hands. So it just shows more significance to some of the stuff. The women came, remember we said donate whatever you wanted, and the women came and had these gorgeous mirrors. I guess they had mirrors back then, and they said, Moses, here's our gorgeous mirrors that we used to put on makeup and lipstick and make our hair beautiful. Moses, here are our beautiful mirrors. So the Medrash, I believe, tells us that Moses said, what, you're bringing your mirrors that you put on lipstick with to the temple? I mean, this is not like this is the temple. This is a shul over here. This is not a massage parlor. This is not one of these hair places, there you bring your mirrors. This is the Beis Hamikdash. And Moses didn't want to take it. And Hashem said, no, Moses, take the mirrors. You need to take the mirrors. He said, why? These mirrors are the most powerful things. This is what happened was in Egypt, what was the whole plan of the Egyptians? They wanted to get the men to beat them up, to work them so hard that they shouldn't want to have kids. That was their way of stopping the Jews because they're becoming too many. So they made them work so hard so they wouldn't have kids. The women used the mirrors to look attractive to their husbands and keep the relationship going. And that's how the future Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, was born. And Hashem says, those mirrors, that's exactly what I want inside the temple. And they ended up building the kiyar, the wash basin from them. They were actually important. But I don't believe it was the altar. I believe it was the great interesting medrash about the material used. I believe it was a wash basin, actually.
So where was the wash basin in here, or it was?
The wash basin will be put, did you see the picture of the Mishkan and the altar? In between the Mishkan and the altar, okay. I believe right there, we're going to learn about it still, was the special wash basin that was built that the Kohanim would wash their hands and their feet. Until today, before the Kohanim blessed the congregation, we wash the Kohanim's hands. A similar idea. We actually, according to a lot of people, we wash Negovasser, we wash our hands before we daven to replicate that wash basin that they had actually inside the temple. So a lot of things we do today replicate that idea. Yeah, very good. Good point, Andrea. Thank you. I believe offhand, I didn't look it up now. Offhand, I believe it was the wash basin copper that was especially unique to Hashem. Great, awesome, very good. Anyone else? Any questions or comments on what we learned today?
I got a question.
Yes.
I don't even know how to formulate this, but
I'll help you. I'll try to help you.
Okay. So obviously this is very important. This is, you said it's going to be taking up a few of the parshas coming up, moving forward. This is like kind of the first time in the parshas since we started, it's saying, what we need to do physically for Hashem, like building this house is our mission for him, rather than him doing everything for us, or spiritual growth and how to treat each other, how to treat society, and like all these civil laws and being a good person. This is actually the first time we're actually getting step-by-step blueprint of how to build something for him.
Like, it's a good example. Last week's parsha was how we should treat each other. First God, and maybe that's an interesting idea. I like that. You just gave me an interesting thought. Last week's Torah portion was Mishpatim. First God said, listen, you learn how to treat each other, and took care of that. And the next Torah portion is God saying, you should learn how to have a relationship with me. I think you actually said something you just got my mind thinking, a very interesting idea, because it's actually, I'm trying to think, according to some, it could be out of order, no, but that's the way it was. First, the Torah tells us how to treat each other, and then the Torah tells us what we can do for Hashem. What can you do for God, So this is, you want to do something for me, this is the tabernacle you could build for me. Yeah.
But how do we resemble building a tabernacle? Are we supposed to be building one? What is our job now? Even though this is what it said 3,000 years ago, I know this is still relevant now. And I know we mentioned that we have the synagogues and, we kind of resemble it. But it's not apples to apples. This is something straight up that God's asking us to build for him, giving our best and to put our sweat equity into it. How do we?
So according to, I saw a very interesting thing. The question really is, are we obligated today to go to the Temple Mount and build a building there for Hashem? Like, do we need to actually go up there?
This wasn't even on the Temple Mount. This was in the desert.
Correct. And then Hashem said, I will show you when I get to Israel where I want it. In the times of King David, God showed there was a place called Shiloh. Andrea shared with me a picture yesterday, where the tabernacle stood in Israel, and then it became the Beis Hamikdash, the Temple Mount. That's where the Dome of the Rock is, and so on. That is the location Hashem said, this is where my permanent place, where I want the Beis Hamikdash to be built. Later on, the Muslims went and built their mosques over there, but that is the place. So I believe the question you're asking is a very interesting question, which I gave a class on years ago, is do we have an obligation today to build the temple on the Temple Mount? Do we have an obligation to do this? We should go to Israel, make a funding, a crowdfunding, get permission from Biden or whatever, and or not, and then go to the Temple Mount and build a Beis Hamikdash. Do we have that obligation there, right? Is that your question? Or not really?
To be honest, Joe, I did some research. It sounds like they already started that process.
So, according to the chinuch, the obligation does not become solidified because here's something interesting. There are certain mitzvahs that are you as a person. Then there are certain mitzvahs that are also as a community that are not a personal mitzvah. For example, I guess like who's the shul does stuff, like who announces that it's Rosh Chodesh in the shul, you know what I mean? Who is the one at the times of the temple that would decide that it's Rosh Chodesh? The rabbi would do it. You wouldn't be the one to do it. It would be a communal obligation. So the building of the Beis Hamikdash is really a communal obligation, is not a personal obligation. The question becomes, do we have that communal obligation now? There probably will people who will tell you, yes, like right now, let me up there, let me build it. As long as it's as the police won't stop me, they'll go and build the Temple Mount. According to the Chinuch, the obligation, just one interesting opinion, the obligation of building the temple is not until 51% of the Jewish people live in Israel. So as long as we're living mostly out of Israel, the communal obligation does not become an obligation. So in other words, right, with the Temple Mount has become the place where it should be, as long as 50% of the Jews are still living out of Israel, there's no obligation to actually build a Temple Mount. It's not until 51% of the Jews live there that it's an obligation to build a Temple Mount. But that's one point. I'll tell you another point. According to the Rebbe bases it off Maimonides and the Rambam that the way Mashiach is going to come is that first Mashiach will come, and then he will help with the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. It won't. The next step will be is first Mashiach and then the building of the Beis Hamikdash. So there is an obligation of us, but the way it's going to play out seems from Maimonides, from the Rambam, that the way the prophecy and so on will play out is that it will first be Mashiach will come and then we'll build the temple, the actual Beis Hamikdash. But for now, Hashem gave us little shuls. Those are where we live, and that's why we need to go to shul today. So everybody needs to go to shul today and do whatever they need to do in a shul, because we don't have our shul. We need to help build the shul, and we need to support the shul, and we need to go daven in the shul. And those are all the miniature shuls, the Mikdash Mi'at, the little miniature shuls that we have instead of the Beis Hamikdash today. And the shul's a replica of that. The lights.
What's the breakup of the percentage of people living outside of Israel? Do you know?
It's getting closer. It's getting closer to 51%. Yes, we're getting there. It's about
I found some interesting stuff that there's like this whole movement in Israel. I believe it's through the Orthodox community. I think they already have they built so many utensils part of the Mishkan. And
someone mentioned, you weren't here yesterday. Andrea mentioned it in our class yesterday, actually. She was there. You can go there. They're ready to go. They teach the Kohanim what we learned. They learn on a college level, I guess, in great detail. And then they have the people ready to go, and they have the items ready to go. Even they're ready to roll. As soon as Mashiach will come, they're ready to bring the stuff in. Correct.
I remember hearing somewhere somebody was saying, I don't know where, I've seen it somewhere. They were saying part of it, what the Rebbe is saying. I guess the Mashiach has to come, then the temple will be built. Then I heard another commentary saying that we really need to start building it, then Mashiach will come, meaning like he'll finish it off for us and like make it happen. But it's kind of like, all these stories. We have to first go into the water and let the water get to the head of us, and then the sea will split.
Yeah, right. There are people who say that, but that's not that's not the Rebbe's perspective on it. The Rebbe says, in this case at least, we need to be the one to bring Mashiach by getting the Jewish people closer to where they need to be, and then automatically it will be reflected in, which is actually today's Tanya. That brings us to today's Tanya. So let's switch gears